And I was really listening very carefully to wonderful, rich presentations today and thinking how can I relate to that, having my specific trajectory, because I started as a literary theorist back in the 1980s in Moscow State University, and my first interest in this, I wouldn't say particularly art or even literature, but more of the shock of the first shock of the post-Soviet human condition was related to literature, because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on multiculturalism in American fiction, and through that I got acquainted with post-colonial discourse, and then I got acquainted with decolonial thought that I would tell a little bit in a minute, a little bit more in a minute. And then I thought that it would be very interesting to also look at similar processes that were taking part particularly at that time in Russia and in other post-Soviet states, and I wrote on a book which focused more on literature, not on art at that point. And then more than 10 years after that, 14 years after, I wrote this other book where I come back to this question, I guess, and try to look at what happened in these 3 decades and how can we conceptualize this post-Soviet or post-socialist wider condition. And does it relate to any other similar discourses like post-colonial discourse or decolonial, or maybe other similar critical discourses that have emerged recently, like post-dependence discourse, for example, in Poland, or other similar discourses. And so that is something that bothers me, still bothers me even today, although I can see when I talk with, let's say, the younger generation of artists, of scholars, of writers, I see that this post-Soviet and post-social dimension is slowly going away and giving place to something else. And that is also a very interesting thing, I think, an important thing to address, like what is coming instead of that. And at the same time, of course, I cannot possibly limit myself to the 1990s or to the so-called Eastern Europe, because both concepts are highly problematic, of course, and highly constructed, and many artworks, many cultural artifacts, phenomena that chronologically perhaps wouldn't fit into the 1990s, they nevertheless, I think, very successfully capture the spirit of the 1990s. And here we have to be very generous, I guess, and with this kind of boundaries, because they have to be very blurred and very open. Similarly, I think one cannot help looking at the collapse of the socialist system and what followed within the next 30 years in mind, the 3 decades that have witnessed the shift in the geopolitical alliances of what used to be the so-called Second World and what subsequently was labeled Eastern Europe in presumably more geographical way, but we all know how questionable and problematic these boundaries are, like where Eastern Europe starts, where Western Europe ends. And I remember that maybe 10 years ago, I had a very interesting experience teaching these concepts and mentioning these concepts in different contexts. Like when I was in Germany, in Bremen University, maybe 10 years ago, and it was political science department or something, and I was talking about Eastern Europe, Western, and I asked the students where for you Europe ends and Asia starts. And they said, in East Berlin. This is where Asia starts for us, right? But then 5 years after that, I was teaching another course in North America, and there were different students, including students from Mexico, from South America, from Central America. And one of them said, no, it's not important, because now what is important is the global North and global South. So for us, there is no difference between Russia and Germany. It's all North. But then I started thinking even more about that, and I wrote an article where I call Russia the poor North. Like it is North, but it's not real North. And so there is a lot of things like that are connected with what we're discussing, and one of the possible kind of reflections on that is offered in decolonial option when they're trying to replace these Cold War divisions, let's say, that still reemerge with something different. And they come up with this idea, like we can speak about de-Westernizing tendencies, re-Westernizing tendencies, and decolonial tendencies in today's world. And I'm not saying, of course, that art kind of can be aligned with this. Art is more complex and questionable and open in its, I guess, agendas. But at the same time, I think it makes sense, because what happens with a lot of what used to be called post-socialist or connected with state socialism before, today gravitates to one of these options. It's either re-Westernization, or as so many people said, to say catching up with the West, trying to become the West, trying to join Europe, or it's de-Westernization, which of course is not so typical yet for post-socialist countries, but it all depends on what countries we're talking about. If it's countries like Estonia, for instance, that can claim its European heritage and it's belonging to Europe, even if in sometimes questionable positionalities, then it's still a narrative of coming to terms with modernity and taking a special place in it, I guess, as a narrative. But then if you talk about countries that cannot claim a European belonging, like non-Western, non-European, non-white, non-Christian colonies of Russian Empire and then Soviet Union, then of course in their case they cannot dream of Europe and they have to find other alliances, and then it would be probably this de-Westernizing ends. Since I've been for almost 20 years working within the so-called decolonial collective, international collective, for me, the most interesting alternative here would be the decolonial alternative. And I would say maybe a few words about that. So here you see this definition of decoloniality. There are many definitions of decoloniality, but this is the most fresh one that was offered in the book published by these two scholars, Catherine Walsh from Ecuador and Walter Mignolo from Duke University, in their book on decoloniality. And it's also symptomatic that if before we were more speaking about coloniality of knowledge, coloniality of senses, coloniality of aesthesis, now we shift to decoloniality as a more positive project of what you do with everything, how you change yourself, the way you look at the things, at people, at the world, to perform this decoloniality. As a critique and delinking from the habits modernity implanted in all of us. And of course, the accent here would be not on political decolonization. That is an outdated discourse, let's say, of the Cold War, but more on decoloniality in the sphere of thinking. In the sphere of knowledge production, and also art would be part of it, right? Because art also relates directly to knowledge production. Why it is important and how it's related to what we're discussing, I will try to explain. Because as several speakers mentioned today, there is this decisive historical moment which determines the global geopolitical and epistemic condition in which we live today. It is the end of the Cold War and the advent of what is called by some scholars the neoliberal globalization as this new eternal universal human condition, the only one allowed, the only kind of prescribed version of Western modernity that is given and offered to everyone. And there are many, symbols of that, many metaphors that come with that, like the end of history that was mentioned several times today, like other metaphors like this. It was marked not only by, let's say, the vanishing of the socialist modernity and the erasing of its agents, but also by the shift from the discourses of decolonization to the conception of decoloniality. And this is an interesting thing, because first, the idea of coloniality as the darker side of modernity comes in 1991. That is around the time when the Cold War ended, right? And when Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano publishes his first article where he defines this concept of coloniality as the indispensable darker side of modernity. And it's a very interesting thing. Like at the time when Fukuyama writes his infamous article about the end of history, Quijano publishes this text about coloniality, which is a shift from decolonization, from political decolonization of the Cold War. And decoloniality then, from the 1990s, early 1990s, becomes this new concept. I wouldn't say that it supplants or replaces, for example, post-colonial theory, as you probably all know, but it kind of tries to build an alternative discourse, which, in contrast with post-colonial theory, I believe, can somehow also involve the post-socialist human condition. And this is what I've been trying to do also in some of my works, trying to see how it works. Well, these guys you know, so I just have two quotations here that show how at the same time, at the same moment in history, you see Fukuyama speaking from the lighter side of modernity, from its dominant side, and you have Aníbal Quijano, who is speaking, of course, from the colonial side of modernity, and his conceptualization is different. And having said all that, I would add that in spite of the fact that Quijano, of course, opens up a whole new space of thinking, I guess, of narrating the story of modernity in a different way, and in spite of the fact that both of them speak about it because of the collapse of socialism, state socialism, because the socialist modernity collapsed, none of them actually mentions this. And that's why I call it the socialist modernity as the elephant in the room. Because it is the elephant in the room which is there, but it's not mentioned. And that's why I think it is very important that we, I mean most of us here, I guess, as people who cannot help being post-socialist or post-Soviet in some cases, we have to speak about this. It's our turn now to stop being these native informants, as Boris said in his lecture, or this silent, subalternized people who don't have their own voice, who cannot speak, who cannot think, and this I see as one of the major problems now, that post-socialism or post-Soviet discourse and wider post-socialism as a discourse has been shaped and formed in such a way that it's still indeed the Western experts that produce knowledge in relation to that. Although there are now some important changes taking place in that area, but still this is one of the discourses that have never been shaped enough, have never been institutionalized, and I'm not saying that it should be institutionalized and called studies, because as a decolonial radical thinker I am against studies because it's a subject-object division kind of thing. But at the same time, I think it's important that these voices are heard, and there should be different voices, different post-socialist voices, including thinkers, including artists, film directors, and social movements, all sorts of things that we are trying to kind of carve a space or create a space of our own thinking, of our own reflection on our condition. This is crucial. At the same time, if you look in a more pragmatic way at how academic discourses were shaped and reshaped after the end of Cold War, we would see, of course, that, and it refers not only to academic research, I mean in philosophy or in cultural studies, but also in art history, of course, in literature and other spheres like that. We would see that even if there were, originally some proclamations like, okay, let's discard the Cold War division of scientific labor or academic labor, and let's invent new categories, let's invent new disciplines. In reality, these new disciplines, they just repeated once again the same Cold War division. And I can give you a very simple example from feminism, since now I'm working more in this feminist area of research, but this is an interesting example. Like, during the late Soviet years and the years of when the Soviet Union was about to collapse, there were several major international feminist conferences at which it was clear, and the division was very sharp and clear, that post-colonial feminists, they were responsible for issues of cultural difference and racial difference. This is what they specialized in, so to say, and that this is what they were allowed to talk about, and they also referred to art. Or literature. While socialist feminists, they were responsible for ideological differences, and this was the only difference, the only intersection that was allowed to them. When socialist modernity ceases to exist, then what happens? These people disappear. They become the void. They become the new problem people in Du Boisian sense, the people seen as problems, regions seen as problems. And since the ideological difference is not there anymore, they don't have a difference. They don't have a difference, and then the only choice, the only option that is left is to mingle with what is there. And an interesting process happens, because when they try to mingle with the West, then it doesn't happen. Then you have this wonderful discourse of catching up, which of course never works, because you cannot catch up with modernity. It's designed in such a way that certain groups of population will never catch up. Or if you refuse to do that and you try to do what a lot of feminists and artists also from Eastern Europe, from the Balkan region tried to do in the 90s and 2000s, is to appropriate some of the post-colonial discourse and categories coming from post-colonial discourse to describe their own situation, to kind of criticize the neoliberal modernity, neoliberal globalization as a new kind of coloniality, and address issues of racialization, subalternization of Eastern Europeans and other post-socialist people. Then, of course, it's again seen as an appropriation, and there are a lot of post-colonial theorists and practitioners. They see it as an appropriation, and they're very much against that. And so this dialogue that could be very interesting, and this alliance that could be very interesting between people from, let's say, the global south and the former socialist world never actually started, or it's only starting now, let's say. I am working on this now. I just came back from India, where we worked precisely on that. I was at several universities, and we were speaking with different people there, and I found out that they're really eager to learn more about socialism and post-socialism, and maybe revisit their ideal notions of socialism that they used to have during the Cold War, and rethink it now, and also resurrect some of the memories that were buried very deep inside because of this neoliberal churn. So there are a lot of issues here that I think we could address. Well, this is, of course, not new, you all know that, but I think that it's interesting to also reflect on this positionality of being in the void, of being erased, of being, as Boris Groys says, being kind of sort of, I would say, sent back to the end of the queue. Because this is what happened with the socialist subject, right? So we had our own modernity, which was, I would say, a cousin of capitalist modernity in many ways, because it shared with capitalist modernity many vices and many kind of hang-ups, like progressivism, like the cult of newness, like a lot of other things, like racism, of course, the darker colonial side of any modernity. But then it was also a radically progressivist and sometimes violently progressivist project. And when it collapsed, what happened was that we had literally, we were asked to erase all that experience and forget about it and come backwards and start from scratch. And that feeling, I think, is captured also in Svetlana Alexeyevich quotation. It's actually not from her, it's from one of the interviewers. She gives in her famous book, about socialism. So socialism is over, but we are still here. But it's also interesting, this quotation, because it captures in a very simple and maybe even naive way the thing that we're discussing here, this connection between spatiality and temporality. Because when people in the West discuss post-socialism, they mostly mean what? They mean time. They mean the time after socialism. This is how they see it, most of them. But they forget that post-socialism is about spatiality. It's about spaces, it's about countries, it's about millions of people's lives who are still there and who are still struggling to understand who we are, what is our place in this world, how can we fit into it. And here again, many, many options are possible. And I think that if we look, as many of you know, because you know art much better than I do, you see this disillusionment, I think, from the 90s towards what happened in the 2000s and especially now, when this discourse of catching up is showing its again, its darker side, the impossibility of being implemented. And lots of artists, they react to that. And this is, I think, something that we find as a common feature everywhere. This is a good quotation, and I mentioned it in a way already, but it's Jennifer Sutherland. She's a very interesting American political scientist who works with these issues, with criticizing the lack of a post-socialist discourse, the lack of post-socialist voices, the fact that they are not heard and they don't have the right to produce knowledge, or they're only allowed to produce some sensational visual material, I guess, that is then analyzed and abused sometimes in other criticisms. So she was one of the first who actually wrote about that and gave really interesting examples, but she doesn't work with art. She mostly works with feminist issues. And this is my favorite example. You all know it, of course. It's a very, very famous artist, Tanja Ostojić. But I think she was also, for me at least, if I look at back, have this flashback to Eastern European art, and larger post-socialist art, this was one of the first wonderful examples working with these categories and concepts of displacement, replacement, how to find a place for yourself in this new neoliberal modernity, in this how to stop, let's say, being a second-rate European and become a true European, in inverted commas, of course. I'm sure you know this. This is her project, which is called Looking for a Husband with an EU Passport. But what Tanja does today actually continues this, because this is her ongoing work that I also love, Misplaced Woman. That is an ongoing project that takes place in different cities, not only in Europe, but also all over the world now. And I think this is actually going, making a shift maybe from the particular post-socialist experience of a woman who is commodified and put in this sexual market to a more global and at the same time very colonial situation of these women's bodies that are displaced, that are kind of unhomed in Homi Bhabha's sense, right, and cannot be positioned in any other, kind of rooted in any other situation. That, I think, is a very interesting kind of development that we find. And another thing that I was also recently thinking about, because I was giving recently several talks in quite diverse environments. One was in South Africa, then, as I said, in India, then several in Europe. And people are all now talking about this fashionable topic of the ultra-right, the fundamentalist turn, and all that. And I was also thinking about it through the decolonial lens. And I guess for me, the shift can be summarized like this. Like when you have the first stage, when we have had the first stage of of this neoliberal globalization coming, it was still seen mostly in very positive, rosy, kind of, optimistic terms. And all of these discussions of, okay, from now on there will be one small shrunken world, and the borders will be erased, everybody will be this kind of symbol of globalization as a tourist. Nobody thought that the symbol of globalization will be a refugee, not a tourist, and that not only money will be traveling, but millions of people will be traveling, trying to avoid death, starvation, wars, and all of that. And all of this, of course, brings us to this bankruptcy of so many concepts, of so many things like democracy, like human rights, like civil society, that was also mentioned several times today. And I think that at this point, when globalization reaches again its darker colonial, we can say, it's not a stage even, it's like a phase, I guess. Then all of these discourses like we have now, the ultra-nationalists, the ultra-right, the fascists, they come up. They come up because this is a reaction of a disillusioned subject of globalization, realize that his life or her life or their life is also dispensable and nobody is exempt from this global coloniality. So I think these are the issues that in the 90s maybe they resonated more on a local level, in particular countries, if we take some post-socialist countries, but today they lost this particular national belonging, and we see more and more even younger generation of artists who reflect on this kind of transgressing the national borders and somehow putting these echoes and these kind of parallels with wider colonial problems. Now, this is my nostalgic thing that, of course, is not European, well, questionably European, because the director who made this performance in Tashkent in Ilhom Theater in the early 1990s, of course, is a European, and I mean, maybe global phenomenon. It's Mark Weil, who was later murdered, assassinated in Tashkent, and this is one of the first performances that they made as a reaction to this new post-Soviet, post-socialist human condition again. Very, very interesting thing. It's their interpretation of the comedy Happy Beggars, Carlo Gozzi's famous comedy from 1764. Mark Weil fuses in this show the sources one could hardly imagine in dialogue. First of all, it's Uzbek street theater, Mazharaboz, and then Commedia dell'arte, of course. And the whole thing is totally, I mean, it tries to convey this feeling of disorder. It's all placed, the whole performance takes place in the old train station as a quintessence of the early post-Soviet Babylonian life and the symbol of displacement, of unhomeliness, this temporality, the temporary home or for migrants, refugees, imperial war veterans, vagabonds, crooks, beggars, transcultural misfits. And what is also wonderful in this performance is that they switch languages all the time. They constantly switch from one language to another, one epoch, from one culture to another, creating a very, very interesting, very, very typically post-Soviet complex mosaic, post-colonial, post-Soviet, post-socialist, falling out of history, yet finding itself suddenly at a global intersection of continents, mentalities, and value systems. And another similar example that some of you probably have seen, because it's used also in my article that Victor published in Художественный журнал, and I also use it in one of the books that you mentioned. It's two works. One of them, of course, you all recognize because you are art historians, is Yves Klein's famous 1960 photomontage Le Saut dans le Vide, which of course is a great example, celebrating a sense of emancipation, of artistic impulse, transcendence, negating gravity. And another one is not from the 90s, but it's from early 2000s. So I think in that sense it captures the late 90s feeling. It's Ciprian Mureșan, Romanian artist, and his ironic kind of also photo work, which is also called the same, Leap into the Void After 3 Seconds, and captures this bitterness of that decade of the 90s, concentrating on the painful and degrading fall coming 3 seconds after the leap. And of course, again, as in some of the examples of actionism that we saw before today, it's the same. It repeats the same cobbled streets of some unrecognized European city, but the accent on the fall rather than the leap, I think, makes a whole difference, symbolizing the gist of this post-socialist initial hope, bitter disappointment, and the subsequent emergence of some critical reflection on our condition, on any prospects for the future. And do we have any prospects? Do we have any future? Importantly, I think this displacement of the post-socialist world was much deeper and more fundamental than the post-colonial one. So if we compare, we can say that post-colonial still had its slow progressivism, its developmentalism, and in a sense it was doing it within one kind of modernity. While in our case it was a very drastic shift, because one modernity was cancelled and we didn't have a place in the other one. So we had to start competing for that place, so carving a space for ourselves in this global human taxonomy that was created in the 16th century and since then and developed and reproduced again and again, and is still being reproduced. And of course there is no space for us there. For many people, I think, existentially it was what can be called maybe a phenomenological disappearance. And here I'm quoting Yampolsky and his take on negative phenomenology, which he gives in connection with my favorite movie that I don't know if you saw it. It's Alexei German's film, Hrustalев, My Car. And it was, I think, released in 1998. And it is a perfect example for me of this post-Soviet / post-socialist human condition, with a central metaphor of radical disappearance into nothingness as the only way out. And it ultimately serves as a very fitting metaphor of the socialist and post-socialist condition, with its deferred repentance, or lacking repentance, with its enmeshing of forgetting and forgiving, which never results in reconciliation. And ultimately, I would say, maybe you disagree with me, with this futureless ontology. It's a futureless ontology. It does not have a future dimension. And I think that we live in that situation still today, maybe particularly today. This is a radical displacement in which the space remains deceivingly the same, but people, the inhabitants of this space, go through this phenomenological disappearance, like this main character, General Klensky. This is the final scene of the movie. If you remember, it takes place 10 years after the main events of 1953, Stalin's death. It opens the film to the outside, but not in the usual way of looking into the future, as you would expect it to be. Rather, I think that German stresses once again the painful, inescapable bondage and humiliation as some kind of eternal, inevitable human condition that he finds. Well, at that point he finds it in Russian history, but in his last movie he finds it, I'm afraid, in like global history. He reflects like that about humanity in general. So how can one escape this? Only through being displaced into nothingness. And in the end, we learn that the main character was neither among the arrested nor among the dead. He literally became nothing and nobody. Clearly, this disappearance, this phenomenological disappearance, and the constant presence of the nothingness contained in the very way of existence is not only about Stalin's epoch. It's also a signifying feature of the post-socialist human condition today. And German films offers, I think, a very early model of this denial of the any kind of transcendence, any heavenly vertical, or any kind of coping with this situation, which is particularly clear and grotesque in this scene that you see here. It's a final scene where the ex-general has a glass of cheap wine balancing on his head. And it hardly can be interpreted as a connection with Christ or anything of the kind. Displacement as this kind of non-being is of course a recurrent theme not only in the case of Russia, as you see here is maybe an extreme case, but also in Eastern European art, cinema, fiction in the last 3 decades. Often this ultimate displacement is channeled through negated or problematized identities. In this case, it can be human identities of any kind. It can be national identities, political identities. An interesting development of this theme I find in the works of 2 Estonian artists. And of course, I'm not an expert here, but I really love these 2 works. One of them you recognize, it's Flo Kasyaru's Estonian sculpture, I Am Dead, from 2005. And another one is another favorite artist of mine. Well, I will try to show you a very short video. It's Liina Siib, an interview with whom you find in my last book, and we're really good friends with Liina. And this is her video art, which is called Compromise Excluded. These are screenshots from there, from 2003. And both of them use this phrase, I am dead, or in Estonian is in the first case. Yet Kasyaru reflects, I think, on the exhaustion of the national identity of a specific souvenir kind that has represented Estonian culture for many years, while in Siib's video art, which is one of my favorite works of this artist, the same words are repeated by a group of these people that you see here, a group of representatives, I would say obviously Russian national minority, who are seeing off the leaving Soviet troops at Tallinn's Freedom Square. And their songs that time are over, of course, indeed they are dead, yet for some reason the celebration of the end of the Soviet occupation ends at a very uneasy note, which is stressed even in the selection of music, and I will just try to play it for you. It's the bravura military marches with comical libretto are finally replaced with vaguely alarming imperial farewell of Slavyanka, with its ecstatic loyalty to the motherland and willingness to die for it, of course. Now, I am very stupid about this kind of technical things, but I will try to play it for you. It's the very end of this video art. It's rather long, but you can see it here.
Жить и любить помогает, она как други зовет и ведет, и тот, кто с песней по жизни живет. I am dead.
am dead. I 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 am dead. I.
Okay. So we go back to tempo localities. Maybe just a few words, since we don't have much time left. Why tempo localities? When I came up with this term, and of course I'm aware of the fact that it's not a good idea to multiply terms and come up with new terms, but I just needed to come up with this temporal spatial term because I didn't feel happy with the existing ones, like, of course, the classical Bakhtin chronotope and maybe Foucauldian heterotopias as well, because both of them, I mean, for me, were problematic because of their geopolitics of knowledge and body politics of knowledge, from where they were formulated and for whom and in relation to what. And that's why when I was writing about these post-socialist novels, post-Soviet artworks and films and books, I decided to come up with this term because I was trying to read Foucault, and particularly Bakhtin in that sense, in that case, and see what other chronotopes or other tempo localities that were important for this post-Soviet and post-socialist sensibilities were never mentioned, of course, and could not be mentioned by Bakhtin because he was writing his works about chronotope in relation to Western European classical modernist, modern, let's say, modern novel, 18th century, 19th century novel. And so, of course, the things that were important for us, and that were connected, of course, with these particular issues of displacement, of lack of home, this unhomeliness, the rethinking of ideal, the chronotopes of war, and other such things. They were, of course, never mentioned by Bakhtin. And one of the first works that I encountered, it's a kind of documentary of Joan Richardson, a diasporic Romanian also filmmaker and video art maker. It's called A Letter from Moldova, and it precisely deals with these questions of displacement and trying to find a new space and trying to see how memory is materialized in most unexpected places, from words to real physical spaces, and what do we do about it? What are different ways of dealing with these contaminated spaces that we find in different post-Soviet, post-socialist cities, and some of them are also post-colonial cities like Tashkent or Baku, for instance. But in this case, it referred to Moldova, and it referred to this really weird feeling, a reminiscence of the future which never happened, as she says in the film. And around that time, a little bit earlier, starting from very, very late 90s, there were several films made like that dealt with these urban realities or sometimes urban fantasies. Very interesting cases of tempo-local nostalgia, which was represented in case of post-socialist, post-colonial artists, authors who tend to juxtapose these idealized portraits of colonial capitals and the sinister, ruthless, often phantasmagoric imperial cities. As I said, I was first doing it in relation to literature, in relation to several novels, but also we can find it, as in this case, in a documentary. And there was another one very similar, I think, made by Mark Weil, again, the same director from Tashkent. It's called The End of an Era, Tashkent. It's really a great thing. In many ways, questioning Soviet Orientalism, but also showing an alternative history of colonization of Tashkent and what it used to be in Soviet years. And in a way, it's also very nostalgic, in a questionable way sometimes, but its visuality, I think, is very interesting and important to maybe to analyze. And this tempo locality, it can have this nostalgic kind of element, but it can also be very rough and very violent at times, and it's more and more increasingly so because there are so many artists who work with the tempo-localities of war. And it can be different wars. It can be these post-Soviet, post-colonial wars, minor wars, so to say, that you find in the Caucasus, that you find in other places. In this sense, there are so many interesting examples. I will not specifically talk about Aslan Gaysumov, although he would be a perfect example here, but I will speak of something connected with Estonia again. I'm sure that all of you know this film. And I think it's really, really a good example. The Mandarini, or the tangerines in English, yes. Estonian, Georgian 2013 film directed by Zaza Urushadze, a Georgian director, which of course was made later, but it focuses on the 1990s, 1992-93 Citrus War, the so-called Citrus War between Georgia and Abkhazia. And for me, this is again an almost paradigmatic case of the post-socialist rethinking of the ideal chronotype. In Bakhtin's interpretation and development of the specific war tempo-locality. It's done in a very interesting aesthetic manner, like a peculiar parable manner, which is recognizable in both Baltic and Georgian cinematic traditions, intersecting through the post-Soviet, post-colonial consciousness and experience. And it's a very interesting film because it's a war film, but we don't see any war there. There are no battle scenes. Instead, the narrative viewpoint mostly centers around the peaceful Estonians and the casual consequences of war they have to deal with. And in that sense, it's a no man's war for the common people who are dying as cannon fodder or as casualties, but it's also the war of the unseen and deliberately unrepresented geopolitical powers for the dominance in the Caucasus. And in that sense, it's a perfect kind of modern, contemporary post-colonial war. The film is brilliantly simple, I would say, and at the same time very complex in its intersections of different affective channels, the way it plays on music, on visuality, on dialogue, and the way it also shifts the typical Bakhtinian interpretation of idyllic chronotype, of idyllic nature, and the almost documentary shots of the evidences of war. And of course, the central problem that it addresses is the problem of home. And it problematizes the idea of home, native land, one's exclusive right to them, which presumably excuses wars and killings and presupposes the notorious divisions into us and them. And in that sense, everybody in this movie is entitled to this land in various ways. The Georgians, the Abkhazians, and even the Estonians who ended up in this place long ago in 1880s, in the end of the 19th century, in quest of better life, and gradually made this land their own. In that sense, Tangerines, I think, is an alternative history of the Soviet people's friendship, the notorious Druzhba Narodov, people's friendship, and its inglorious end and metamorphosis into some other human condition and a community of sense which stands above these imposed wars. Of course, it's interesting that today it's very hard to speak of any post-Soviet community of sense, to use this term, I think, coined by Rancière, right? So what would be this post-Soviet or wider post-socialist community of sense, a part of the shrinking linguistic sphere? I mean, it's shrinking also because of the generational shifts, right? So the younger generation don't speak Russian anymore. And then another thing is, I think, that still connects us as a negative thing. It's a negative identity connected with the feeling of the looming end, one's exclusion from the world history or from modernity. And in that sense, I don't know if you agree with me or not, but I think that increasingly there is this feeling that the Soviet is taking its place on the museum shelf, and for the younger generation is no more painful than in case of other periods of history. So in that sense, it's already detached. It's no longer dominating as it used to be in the 90s or in the early 2000s. The post-Soviet space more and more often gravitates towards this blurred and very kind of undefined, unhomed human condition, which doesn't require an immediate rerouting. And that is an interesting shift that again connects, in my opinion, with this decolonial unhomeliness, with this decolonial sense of being at home in the airport, or I don't know, in the triangle in the Atlantic, if you connect it with the slave trade. So the space itself is very, very often an imagined space, liquid, arbitrary, virtual, as if it has lost its physical stability together with never attained stability of life, of social, economic, political life. So the idea of home here is very much a question, of course, and again we find it in so many works, but we don't have time to go into that. Maybe the last thing I would like to say is, and I'm struggling with it now myself, because as it was mentioned, I also write fiction, and my last novel that I finished writing 2 weeks ago is called, in English, it has an English name, although it's written partly in Russian, partly in English, partly in other languages. It's called Flotsam and Jetsam. And for me, this is the ultimate human condition in which I am, and I think a lot of other post-Soviet people are, especially those who are diasporic and live elsewhere. So this flotsam and jetsam of modernity, flotsam and jetsam of history, because history bypassed us and went in a different direction. It hasn't stopped, of course, but it went someplace else and somewhere else in some other direction. So this is an interesting thing, and what do you do about it? I do what we call in decolonial option a border thinking and border existence. And it's about not crossing borders, but being a border. You're always the border. You're always an other in any condition, in any situation. But you work with it creatively. You don't see it as a tragedy. You see it as a trickster. And you react as a trickster to this condition. You don't cross borders, but the border cuts through you, and then it's an interesting process. Like, what do you do about these multiple identifications as a process? And the human being in this situation, I think, I mean, of course we cannot generalize, but the human being generally turns into an expatriate, not within their environment. So it's not any longer a story about the West or Europe, but it's more expatriate in the whole world. So that contemporary subject is expatriating in these truly global frames. For me, this sensibility is captured in a very simple line, which I use also as my own logo, and which is the core of my latest book. It sounds like that. I am a bird, not a tree. And I mean, you don't have to agree with that, but this is the solution I offer for this post-socialist and post-Soviet existence. Thank you.